Hey, I want to tell you about a podcast from our friends at Slate. It's a show called 1 Year. It's about the people and struggles that changed the United States of America 1 year at a time. In each episode, host Josh Levin explores a story that you might have forgotten or maybe never heard about before. The first season focuses on 1977, a spectacular year in which I was born, and a year when gay rights hung in the balance, roots dominated the airwaves, and Jesus appeared on a tortilla. How does America's past shape its present? Listen to 1 Year on any podcast app. Support for this podcast comes from Dispatch Coffee. Dispatch ships 1 monthly delivery of their coffee beans to doorsteps across Canada. Their coffee is high quality, responsibly traded, and fairly priced. Shipping is free across Canada. Listeners to this show are getting a great deal when they go to dispatchcoffee.ca and use the promo code CanadaLand50 at checkout for 50% off your first subscription. Again, that's dispatchcoffee.ca, promo code CanadaLand50 at checkout for 50% off your first subscription. Sandy Garasino, writer, former Crown prosecutor. Welcome back to Shortcuts, where we talk shit about the news.
Great to be here, Jesse. I haven't heard your voice for a long time, so great to talk to you.
It's been too long. Today on the show, a multi-million-dollar public inquiry finally reveals the true enemy of Alberta oil, reality. It turns out it was reality and science all along. They've been out to get the tar sands. Also, Sandy, if you can't beat them, pay them. Facebook and the Globe and Mail join forces, and I want in on the action. We'll get into it.
Well, let's.
This episode is brought to everybody by Steve Charters, Deborah English, Elizabeth Loftus, Marcus Medford, Jessica Byron, Chris Hutton, Cosmo in Sudbury, and Zach.
I'm Zach, a photographer in Toronto, and I support Canada Land because my frustration with this country writ large is often mirrored in the frustrations aired on the network shows. These folks are holding to account some pretty big players, and their tone in recent years seems appropriate to the severity or stupidity of each case. And Jesse's fallibility is something we can all relate to.
Sandy, I believe that Jason Kenney ran on a promise to not only set up a war room to fight messaging from Alberta's enemies, but I think it was a campaign promise that he was going to get to the bottom of the foreign money that was secretly funneling in to so-called environmentalist organizations so that they could landlock Alberta oil under the guise of trying to save the planet. Here is what that sounded like when news of this inquiry was reported in 2019.
Saying Canada is seen as an easy target, the Alberta government is launching a public inquiry into the campaign against the province's energy sector.
The UCP will spend $2.5 million on a public inquiry into foreign-funded special interest groups. The opposition NDP calls the inquiry the equivalent of hiring someone to do a glorified Google search.
A commissioner appointed by the government will have a year to do some digging, including to potentially compel witness testimony.
So this was widely covered that this accountant had been hired by Jason Kenney, $2.5 million. Then it got bumped up to $3.5 million. He was going to get to the bottom of this and track back, follow the money. And then the deadline for the actual investigation, this audit, this inquiry, it got pushed back again and again. And now, as I understand it, it's finally upon us. We're about to get the report, but the report leaked, and you have read it.
I have read it.
Tell me, who's to blame? Who has been out to get Alberta, this anti-Alberta agenda?
So what I have read, and I have read the entirety of the report, and I mean, to say that this is a dog's breakfast is an insult to dogs' breakfasts, because the commissioner, Steve Allen, made his findings without ever hearing from any of the organizations or examining any of the original documentation. He doesn't know anything about the intent of any of the grants that he's writing about. but he's making findings that a whole slew of them are anti-Albertan. He is sending his findings to all of the groups that he's found to be anti-Albertan, and then ask them, before I sentence you, would you like to say anything in your own defense, kind of thing. So we don't know what the groups are saying in response to this, not having been heard in over 2 years. All we know is that he found that there was no conspiracy. This was the big thing, that it was supposed to be this big conspiracy by shadowy American corporate interests that were really the puppet masters behind the scenes that were pulling all the strings and making environmentalists and Indigenous groups oppose Alberta energy projects. So he found that there was no conspiracy, but he did find that a huge number of these organizations were part of an anti-Alberta campaign. And what was really pretty gross about it, just about everything about this is gross, but what's especially odious about this is that almost every major conservation project in Canada has been determined to be anti-Albertan in nature because it could be used possibly to be a limit on tar sands development. So that's the news. Number one, there's no conspiracy. Everybody is motivated by altruistic and appropriate planet and climate motives. But two, they're all anti-Albertan anyway.
This is a crazy mess, and I think it's hard to wrap one's head around it. But this really is a dominant conspiracy theory that goes back quite some time, and I think it's something that Ezra Levant has been shouting about for years. And then there was this so-called researcher, Vivian Krauss, who turned out to be getting paid by some of the interests that she was researching for their conclusions. But essentially the idea that the people who say they're crusading for Indigenous rights or for climate change, that's a bullshit rationale. Really, these are just the astroturf agents of big money U.S. interests who actually have dirtier oil, and they're trying to landlock Alberta oil just for their own selfish market needs. And that's what makes them anti-Alberta. So that's a very popular idea. I haven't read the report. What you're telling me is that there's bupkis, because what would a smoking gun be? A smoking gun would be to actually trace back the funding of Greenpeace, of Dogwood, of these various groups and find, aha, we trace this to one of these very wealthy American or otherwise foreign interests or Saudi interests that has a conflicting interest with the Alberta oil sands. That did not happen, but yet he still did conclude that all of these groups are anti-Alberta because he defines anti-Alberta as just anything critical of oil sands development. Do I have that right?
Not even critical of oil sands development. The overwhelming majority of the money that he has found to be anti-Albertan went into marine conservation or land conservation, like the Great Bear Rainforest or the Canadian Boreal Forest Initiative. Arctic conservation and preservation had nothing to do with the oil sands. There's a small subgroup of the funding that went to the tar sands campaign, which actually is anti-oil sands, is trying to landlock Canadian oil. They're standing up, waving their arms and saying, we are guilty. Yes, it is true. We are trying to stop the development of the Canadian oil sands and tar sands. Yes, we are doing that. But that's just that's not even 10% of what he found to be anti-Albertan. Most of the money that he found to be anti-Albertan in nature went to the Great Bear Rainforest and Pacific marine protection, all of this kind of thing. So there's an absurdity in it all.
The premise always struck me as faulty that, it's not enough of a smoking gun for me if you find that there are American funders who are fighting the oil sands because, climate change does not respect the border. Anybody who's putting money into environmentalism in the States would very quickly find the oil sands as who can we fund to try to stop this? That's not super incriminating to me. It's just this conspiracy idea that it's other fossil fuel interests that are
yes.
That would be something if they came up with that.
Yeah, but there's none of that.
None of that. So I don't want to suggest that the media was credulous of Kenney. There was plenty of pushback, and not just from the National Observer and environmentalist media organizations, but even, the Globe and Mail and others. CBC was like really skeptical of Jason Kenney's talking points. But it got widely covered, and this idea that maybe there is this grand conspiracy certainly went far and wide. Now we're starting to see headlines about, Gary Mason in the Globe and Mail. Alberta's report on anti-energy campaigns looks like a multi-million-dollar dud. So the early signs, like when the report comes out, which I don't know when that's going to be because it's due on the 30th, but they might hold it for a few months, which is interesting politically, is the fact that this was all a huge nothing going to kind of like be a big whimper. Because you'd think that there should be hell to pay for this, given that, $3.5 million, yes, vilification of charities being, on this witch hunt for, foreign influence. But more importantly than any of that, this was time when BC's on fire. So heads should roll, right?
BC's on fire. It looks like around 600 British Columbians died in this heat wave that we got last month, and we're about to go into another one. We lost an entire town, burnt to the ground. Climate change is upon us. The very people who have been doing their level best to try and protect us have been attacked and vilified, not just in this report, but for years. It's not just Jason Kenney when he was a federal minister, and Ezra Levant and Peter Kent. This went all the way to Stephen Harper. It was the CRA audits that went on for several years. Organizations, and I've been speaking to, I'm going to be writing about this, people were attacked. People were physically attacked. They were tracked. They were stalked. What the environmental community has had to sustain, and not just them, also Indigenous people, for trying to stand up for the environment and trying to protect us and trying to bring and focus our attention on climate change. And the absolute campaign that's been going on for almost 10 years now, there should be hell to pay. The much bigger story is that the instruments of state power were employed against Canadians for expressing an opinion opposed to official government policy. And that's an absolute outrage.
A massive multi-year conspiracy theory that got propagated at the highest levels of government reaches a dead end. What's next? And will people care? And what should happen now?
Well, I can imagine that Aaron O'Toole wants this to just get buried and go away in some deep, dark hole. I don't know what's going to happen, but there should be an absolute apology being issued by everybody who was part of tarnishing the names and the reputations of good citizens. I might disagree with one or two about the substance of their positions, but it's absolutely outrageous that Canadians have not been free to express their opinion and have been subjected to subpoena power. I've spoken to individuals who were terrified that they were going to have their texts, their emails, their phones seized about climate change, examined by the government. There needs to be a full-on apology issued for the terrible things that were done and the fact that we are only now finally getting to deal with climate change. And that reputational damage is staying with people, in small communities, small towns. Their neighbors still think and will continue to think, especially with the anti-Alberta brand being branded on them of being anti-Alberta. That will stick.
This episode is supported by Policy Me. The pandemic has reminded us to be prepared for the worst, and Policy Me is an online life insurance company that allows Canadians to buy term life insurance in minutes, 100% online, at the most affordable price. Sandy, I dig this because you don't have to talk to insurance salespeople. You just go online, and in less time than it takes to listen to this podcast, people can get life insurance, which is something that I think a lot of people put off because they don't want to talk to life insurance salespeople, and they don't want to get upsold into life insurance they don't need, which can happen because people just want to get this over with.
It can happen. It can happen. You know what? And one of the other things, too, is that the earlier you start on that stuff, it can be the better down the road.
Yeah. I value, getting things off of that to-do list. And sometimes something can, linger for years. And I just see, unburden yourself. Get it done. I haven't thought about it since. So go and get this knocked off of your list at PolicyMe.com. Get your free life insurance checkup today. Once again, PolicyMe.com. Sandy, it's been a minute, but you've done this with me many times. You know that we duly note things that otherwise might escape people's attention. What have you to duly note this week?
My duly noted is the recent call by NDP leader Jagmeet Singh for the newly installed Governor General, who has barely broken in the China over at Rideau Hall, to refuse to dissolve Parliament and allow Justin Trudeau to go to a federal election if that's what he chooses to do. I'm just gobsmacked at the idea of the NDP calling for the British Crown to interfere in Canadian elections and interfere with the Canadian democratic process. I don't know what he's smoking, but surely this makes no sense to feed this colonial narrative any further.
You're right. It suggests an NDP position for this purely symbolic ceremonial position to actually be politically active. Like, the NDP wants a governor general who's like, no, I don't think so, to the prime minister. And that's a really odd position for the NDP to take. I guess maybe if they did think about this at all before doing it, the thought was that nobody gives a shit about that. Like, the NDP's take on colonialism or the NDP's take on the governor general won't be the important part. The important part will be that Jagmeet Singh needs to be able to tell the electorate, I know you didn't want this election, and I didn't want it either, and I did everything in my power to stop it from happening because it's purely cynical politics from Justin Trudeau, and nobody wants this election. Like, is that the calculation here? Is there calculation here?
Is there a problem with saying that instead of issuing a letter to the Governor General of Canada asking her to stop this? This is a candidate for Prime Minister here.
It's a bit clown shoes. Duly noted. While we're talking about Jason Kenney, I would like to duly note Jason Kenney tweets, the Toronto Globe and Mail, I like that. It's not inaccurate. The Toronto Globe and Mail is having a temper tantrum about pickup trucks. I'm happy to say that about 40% of the vehicles on Alberta roads are pickups. Maybe Toronto columnists should try getting around this province during a prairie blizzard in a smart car. So take that, Toronto smart car wimps. That is with reference to a Marcus Guy, I've never been sure, a column by Marcus, the headline of which, pickup trucks are a plague on Canadian streets. Damn! Hot take from Marcus in the Globe and Mail. Scott Moe, Premier of Saskatchewan, also took a shot at the Globe and Mail for daring to come out against pickup trucks. For a lot of columnists, that's kind of a proud moment when you've successfully painted a bullseye on yourself that's gotten the attention of two premiers. The thing that I'm duly noting is that I don't want to say plagiarize. I just said it, though. There was a column that appeared 2 weeks earlier in Passage by Davide Mastracci that was pretty damn similar. The headline of which was, it's time to ban the sale of pickup trucks. Now, there's no actual sentences lifted. And, multiple columnists might make very similar arguments. But Marcus G., his evidence for his argument was like one after the next. He used the same sources as Davide used. Bloomberg City Lab, pickup trucks are getting larger. Consumer Reports investigation, the hidden dangers of pickup trucks. Recent U.S. report on overriding emissions controls. Like, it's very clear that this Globe columnist relied on Davide's column. And even that you can do, as long as you just say somewhere, as recently noted by Davide Mastracci in Passage. And it's like, give this guy the Margaret Wente Award for originality in column writing. Like, it's just the most stingy, cheap, and it's this bullying thing of like, I can do this because who the hell are you? Passage. Nobody's heard of you. And now we have this dialogue between the premiers and Marcus G, where like, it's just a stolen take.
I didn't see that first column, and I will go and look at it now. So thanks to you, Jesse, for pointing it out. Duly noted.
Sandy, before we get to our final segment, I want to shout out our other series, Commons, because it's so good. Did you hear their episode on Eddie Haymore?
Oh my God, I didn't, but there's an episode on Eddie Haymore. Oh my God, I do have to listen to that.
It's so fucking good. The story of Eddie Haymore.
This is such a good story.
This is just an amazing story that I knew nothing about. This Lebanese Canadian who bought an island and had this absurd dream of building an amusement park with like a massive camel that makes ice cream out of its mouth and it shits garbage out of its tush, and people would come to this island, but the government like actually conspired against him to remove him from his island, and all of that is the least wild part of the Eddie Haymore.
It is the least wild part.
Because what Eddie Haymore did next, I'm rarely actually like fully astonished and surprised by what I hear on podcasts, but I'm not even going to tell you. Listen and subscribe to the new season of Commons Real Estate, wherever you get your podcasts. Sandy, here's a recent headline this week in the Globe and Mail. Facebook partners with Globe, other outlets, to pay for content. And what we learned this week is that Facebook has announced that it is partnering with the Globe and Mail, Glacier Media, and Black Press under their News Innovation Test program. And this follows earlier announcement in May that a bunch of sites, mostly small sites, including BlogTO, the news outlet that you work for, the National Observer, also the Narwhal, Discourse Media, the Tyee, Village Media, but then also like bigger legacy newspapers, Le Devoir, Saltwire, a string of newspapers out east. They were the original partners for the News Innovation Test. Everybody is partnering with Facebook to get paid by Facebook. And before I say another word about this, listeners should know that I have met with Facebook to get Canadaland included in the News Innovation Test. And as a result of that, I've recused myself from reporting on Facebook for Canadaland anymore. I will still talk about Facebook on this show where we analyze and offer opinions. As I chat with you about this, Sandy, maybe it'll be useful for people to hear it from a publisher's perspective, what this is and why I want in on it. But when it comes to actually trying to figure out what's going on and investigating it, my colleagues here will be doing that for Canadaland, not me. But let me ask you, what is your understanding of why the National Observer is a part of this and what it is?
Well, I don't want to. I can't comment on the National Observer. I don't want to comment on the National Observer. I think this entire trend, and I'm sorry to hear that Canadaland is part of it, but this is the nature of journalism, where journalism is all starving and they are looking for any money that they can get. And this is a terrible, terrible initiative. It's a terrible thing to be part of because it has and does, in my opinion, mute and silence the very important criticism that Facebook deserves and the coverage. I am astonished at how little both Google and Facebook have come under the microscope. I mean, there have been stories periodically here and there in Canada, but really, the very muted coverage of their involvement, I mean, the absolute destruction of journalism everywhere goes right to the building of the Google and Facebook empires and their power. But Facebook in particular has been so irresponsible, its algorithms and how it promotes divisive materials. Now we're seeing the disinformation that's going on over COVID, the incredible damage that has been done by this website to American democracy. I don't think that we've had anywhere near the kind of coverage and detailed examination that we need. And it is extremely disturbing to me that this is an entirely cynical initiative by Facebook. There's nothing about this that I think is positive. And I know that you have a more nuanced take about the issue around government support, the taxation that the Canadian government wants to bring in starting in 2022 as part of the OECD measures to tax digital revenues. But I actually think that that's a much more neutral and important way for us to start to be capturing revenues and supporting journalism.
I'm not even sure that I disagree with any of that, except for the part where you consider the government's program more neutral. One casualty of this is that, we rely on, let's say, the Globe and Mail to explain what the heck this is. And there's really no way for a newsreader to, like, when you read this Globe and Mail piece about why they're partnering with Facebook, it says, under the agreement, Facebook pays publishers for the right to offer users links to content on specific topics. Well, what? I can already find links to specific Globe and Mail content. So why would Facebook be paying the Globe and Mail for links when not only does Facebook already offer that, but the Globe and Mail gives that to Facebook for free. The answer is Facebook's not paying for links.
That's right.
I guess what I see here is a macro trend that begins with government interference. I was there at the meetings 6 years ago, where all of the news bosses of Canada got together and said, we're going down the tubes and somebody's got to bail us out. And it should be the government, and it should be Google, and it should be Facebook. And the government should give us money directly, and they should tax Facebook and Google and give us that money as well. That was the plan from the beginning. And then they went about lobbying for that. So it wasn't necessarily investigation and news criticism of Facebook. It was like editorials and paid campaigns for years. And they have a lobby group, and they've just been going hard at Facebook and Google. Friends of Canadian Broadcasting had wanted posters with Mark Zuckerberg's face on them all up around Canada, saying, you're a parasite, you're a news thief.
But this is true, Jesse.
We can disagree on that, because it's really hard to accuse him of stealing your content when you're giving him the content.
It's not about the content, because the content's a very, very minor part. It's the destruction of the business model of the news.
And some people would say that automobiles killed the horse and buggy model.
Horses and buggies don't have an inherent value and importance to democracy. The press is the only industry that is actually explicitly mentioned in the Canadian Constitution, in the Charter of Rights, and it has a crucial and critical role to play. We're not talking horses and buggies, we're talking about pillars of democracy.
Yes, but that pillar of democracy is supposed to be an independent pillar. And what has happened is, in the interests of saving this stalwart champion of democracy, we have destroyed the independence of the press, because as soon as the government got involved, the press was no longer independent, by definition.
But Jesse, there is no clean, easy, sweet, beautiful answer here. But first of all, Facebook and Google and all of the digital platforms, but largely them, we have completely and utterly failed to tax them. And second of all, not only did they destroy the news media by competition, they also destroyed them by not getting taxed on their revenues the way that Canadian news media got taxed on their revenues. The playing field wasn't level. And I agree with you that there are inherent difficulties and problems, but this is just far too serious for us just to be going ahead with this. We don't have a lot of menu items here. Either Facebook pays, this is a tiny amount of money that's involved, or we appropriately tax these behemoths who are making a huge amount of money, and we actually funnel money into news media. When I think about the small local press, the coverage of municipal issues, these are critical issues, and they're gone. They're absolutely starved to death and gone from Canadian media.
I'm going to push back against pretty much every part of that while kind of agreeing in essence with all of it. I'm going to pull that off. Watch me. First of all, you're conflating the necessary taxation of these tech platforms with, and therefore the money needs to go. You started with the premise that we need to somehow have an artificial lifeline for the news media, and there's no other option. Meanwhile, you work for the National Observer, which has been doing a wonderful job in growing over the years, and we have seen a proliferation of small sites that are rebuilding, and it's entirely possible that this stalwart champion of democracy, the legacy news media, has been doing a shitty job, and there was a reckoning coming.
They have been. There have been weaknesses.
So the New York Times has proven that you actually can go to the Canadian consumer on a massive scale,
if you have the brand power of the New York Times.
So what we've seen is that at the highest level, you can get Canadians to pay for news and support a really big, robust news organization. And then on a tiny little local level, there have been wonderful little sparks of light. And maybe there's a process that the market was taking care of, whereby we would have seen some of those players in the middle that have been underserving communities die out, and then those little things get bigger. I have no doubt, actually, that people wake up every morning wanting information. Something would be there to provide that.
And if you put your children's teeth under their pillow, Jesse, in the morning they have loonies and
You're
toonies.
Absolutely right. I have to accept, as a business person that is a dead dream. That whatever faith I had in the early days, I mean, I loved what we were doing here because podcasting is this open ecosystem where we didn't have to ask anybody permission for a blue check mark or, please put us on the newsstand. We could just do it, and powered by people, we could build a news organization. And I thought, wow, this is the future of the media. And I have to be a grown-up now because the interference of the Canadian government picking winners and losers and saying, we're going to make a list of approved media, and now we're going to champion for that list of approved media for the legacy newspaper industry, and we're going to put pressure on Facebook and Google, and then they in turn are also going to start picking winners and losers. And there's a spectrum now where on one end you might get deplatformed, and on the other end, you're now on Facebook. Forget about money from Facebook. I have no option. Facebook is going to either put us in the approved, trustworthy news category, or they could, on the other end of things, push us down on the algorithm, or they could deplatform us entirely. And maybe I could say...
And there's no transparency, by the way, no matter what they pay or what you pay.
But it's the government who put them in that position.
I don't agree with that.
We are seeing, outside of the Canadian government's influence, the platforming of news writ large. So I have relationships with Spotify to feature our podcasts, with Apple to feature our podcasts. Now it's Facebook who are like, yeah, even if they weren't giving money, I would want the blue check mark in the special news category. Yeah. You want to give us money? Yeah, I guess I'd be a fool to say no to it. And so increasingly, this is the future of the news business, where what we're going to see going forward, you're not going to know as a news reader, is this news organization in my feed because this is what people want? And people like me have funded it and subscribed to it, or they have an audience that they're selling advertising against, or more likely, the news that we're going to be getting are going to be propped up by a check from the government, a check from Facebook, a check from Google, and maybe other platforms, and the newsreader has nothing to say about it. And who gets into that category of approved news and who doesn't is completely not transparent, whether it's government or Facebook. They're making these editorial decisions about inclusion, and any rational news publisher would say, I'm too small to resist these trends, so I have to try to get in on the right side of it because it's no longer an option to just sit this out entirely. But I do agree with you. This is fucking up my ability to be a good media reporter, at least in terms of reporting on these tech platforms. So I'm going to have to increasingly consider, why does a news organization split up the role of editor-in-chief from publisher for this very reason? When you've got these tiny newsrooms where it's one person, they do both of those things. And now we're somewhere in the middle, and we're quickly getting to a point where I'm going to have to decide which hat I'm going to wear because I can't wear them all. My
one ad for the New York Times is listen to and read Kara Swisher, who is on top of this stuff phenomenally, and I follow her almost religiously on this stuff. It is very, very concerning, the degree of power and control. And Facebook, I don't trust a single thing that company says or pledges to do.
It's an interesting case because all the things you said about how Facebook has perverted democracy and the fake news problem and the role they've played, you might say to Facebook, well, what are you going to do to turn this around and actually help the news? And then their answer would be, okay, well, what if we actually funded news? And that's exactly what they're doing.
There's no arm's length is the problem.
Well, there's nothing in the deals. They explicitly don't want anything to do with your coverage. This Facebook News Initiative test, whatever, they're like, we don't even want to look at your editorial. There's nothing in it. But then you could ask the question, yeah, but if you get on Facebook's bad side because you've been critical of them, maybe you don't get in at all. The
biggest thing that I feel is that for too long we abdicated all responsibility to address any of the issues, and what we lost in the process, we've lost our press, and especially our small local press, which is a deep tragedy, and we have to be committed to repairing that.
That's Shortcuts. Thank you for, it's always so good to talk to you. Thanks for joining me.
So great to hear your voice.
We're on Twitter at CanadaLand. I can be emailed at jesse@canadaland.com. I read everything you send. Sandy, where can people find you?
You can find me in the National Observer and on Twitter at Garasino.
This episode is produced by Tiffany Lamb with additional production by Tristan Capacchione. Theme music is by So-Called. Syndication is by CFUV 101.9 FM in Victoria. Visit them online at cfuv.ca. If you like what we do and you want to receive ad-free versions of all of our podcasts, we absolutely rely on listener support to make this stuff. So hit the link in the show notes or go to canadaland.com/join.